Hello, Inform Scotland followers and friends. I have just updated the blog on the website for the excess or the all-cause death data. So the blog is called An Update on All-Cause Deaths as of 25th of October 2021. The National Records for Scotland yesterday updated the stats. So this is for the week beginning the 25th of October. I don't have good news. And once again, I'm feeling very somber about this just incredible situation we've got in Scotland now. Please follow us on Twitter under Inform Scotland and keep abreast of what's happening here. And I would encourage everybody to speak to their representatives about this because it's really very grave, and you know, we need answers and people actually addressing this problem honestly. I want to make clear all the excess death data are calculated against the 5-year average. That is, those are the 5 years 2015 to 2019, because we don't want to include 2020 in the data when 2020 was such an extraordinary year. However, it's looking like 2021 is going to be as extraordinary, which I will say more about when we go through these graphs. The cover image graph that I've shown is the graph of mortality since 1974. Now the big dashed line is 2021, and you can see that we have been at historically high levels of death. This is mortality, so it's per thousand population. Historically high numbers of deaths. There is 1 year now we've come below the number of 1 year. That was 1993, when we had quite a severe autumn flu epidemic, I think. Anyway, there's only been 1 year in which we have had less death in week 43 since 1974. Excess deaths by cause, we'll go into cause more later, but this bold blue line shows excess deaths, and you can see that since week 55, I beg your pardon, 66, we have been trending up. We are now at an excess death level very similar to the number of excess deaths we had in January. Now, this is not January, this is the beginning of November, and deaths aren't usually very high at this time of year because everybody's riding on a nice high vitamin D level from the summer, or a relatively high vitamin D level. Deaths by setting, you can see what's been going on. The yellow trace is homes, and deaths in the home have been consistently high since our epidemic or pandemic started. You can see that deaths in hospitals were offset by deaths in the home to a certain extent for some time. However, recently, since week 66, deaths in hospitals have been rising very steadily and very significantly. The last data this week that were presented just seem to be showing a continuation in that trend. There is no change there at all. And deaths in care homes have also been rising. Now, all of that is contributing to an excess. The problem is deaths in the home are not going down. Okay? Graph 3, excess cancer deaths, you can see the bold line there is quite, it jumps about quite a lot. This week there has been a reduction. However, the trend is very much upwards. And I would argue that probably a rising baseline is still evident here. Now, this has been going on since week 55. So that means that for 41 consecutive weeks, well, deaths from cancer have shown an increasing trend. Deaths in the home from cancer have gone down slightly in the last 30 weeks, but deaths in the hospitals have gone up. And deaths in care homes, excess cancer deaths in care homes are trending up as well. Now, for a bit more detail on that, I've put in graphs 4 and 5. That you can see in 2020, cancer deaths were happening in home much more often than they had been before. That's a yellow trace. And in other settings, cancer deaths were pretty much stable and slightly below average. And you might be able to just see there on this graph, there's a very faint blue trend line, which is showing that cancer deaths were pretty much as expected overall last year. If anything, they were trending down slightly, but it's very, very slight. I would say we had a flat excess deaths rate for cancer. However, in 2020, you can see, it'll be easier to spot this trend line, an increasing trend in cancer deaths. Cancer deaths in the home have remained fairly stable, slightly reduced, but deaths in hospital, cancer deaths in hospital have gone back up. And in the last week, if you can see that green trend, that green line there, they have really, really jumped up in the last week. Graph 6 shows that since week 55, that's 41 weeks ago, dementia deaths have been trending up. So look at the bold blue line. COVID kills overwhelmingly the elderly. And so obviously after this big wave of coronavirus in wave 1, we have seen a deficit in dementia deaths since. That would be what you would expect. People cannot die twice. And so what's happened now is dementia deaths have naturally risen and they've passed through average levels and we're now back into excess. Now I would say, apart from obviously this week there, they have been in excess now since week 81. So that is now 15 weeks of interrupted by 1 week in deficit. We've had 15 weeks of excess deaths of dementia. So that is an indication that there's a bit more pain happening in that group again. The next, graph 7, is circulatory deaths. We have seen an increasing trend in circulatory deaths since week 55. Now it went from deficit to excess, but you can clearly see that the trend is more into excess. The jump in circulatory deaths in the last week has been awful. They were at a roughly 0 excess last week, and we've now jumped to almost the level of the first wave of coronavirus. That is an extremely unusual week, and it should not be minimised, the significance of that. There is a lot of pain in that statistic because circulatory deaths are heart disease and stroke. These are probably sudden deaths. People aren't expecting them. They've been happening in the home overwhelmingly. I probably need to get rid of these yellow traces, but you can see in the home they've jumped up, and in hospitals, they've also risen extremely fast. I think obviously that week the hospitals were having a terrible time. That is a very, very sad statistic. I would love to say that I think it's isolated, but I don't think it will be. There were 77 excess circulatory deaths that week. Respiratory deaths, this is my favourite, sort of my anti-favourite. Respiratory deaths have been rising from a very significant deficit back up to average levels. These exclude COVID deaths, so they're back to average numbers now. We've still got the COVID deaths on top of these respiratory deaths. Obviously, since week 55, these have been rising extremely fast, and although we're back up to just average levels now, they are contributing to this excess deaths count as well because they're trending up. I do think that those are going to flatten off now and remain at average levels. So, that should calm down and help to pull the excess deaths to at least flatten. Graph 9 shows, again, since week 66, I don't know what happened in week 66, but since week 66, other excess deaths have been trending up. And they have been well above average for 30 weeks now. The baseline, as you can see, is trending up. And we have had a very comparable number of excess deaths due to other as we had in the first wave of coronavirus. In fact, as I said in one of these blogs, it's the area under the curve that you're interested in. You can see that this peak has been wider than that peak, and so we're talking about a similar number of deaths. Other deaths normally remain pretty average. So there's something other than cancer, dementia, circulatory, respiratory, and COVID that's causing people to die now. And it is currently, if I go back up to graph 1, it's currently, apart from COVID, the second biggest cause of death. So circulatory that week was the most common other cause of death. So it's circulatory and other. Right, just bashing through the next ones. Graph 10, we are on our 6th wave of coronavirus, and you can see those deaths. Even though we've had all these 6 waves, you can really only make out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 waves of COVID deaths. 11 and 12 shows, I've talked about this before, it just shows how in 2020 COVID deaths and excess deaths followed one another quite closely, but excess deaths were in the first half of 2020 actually were less or fewer than COVID deaths. And then in the second half of 2020, excess deaths are now running away from COVID deaths. The gap's getting bigger. So we cannot blame COVID on this excess at all. Now, graph 13 is, to me, the most significant graph in this blog, and I've put a little bit about the numbers. I've said graph 13, a comparison of excess deaths in 2020 and 2021. Since week 20 of this year, that's when this continuous excess started, we have seen 3,542 excess deaths. In the whole of 2021 so far, we have seen 4,693 excess deaths. That's about 4.5 weeks of excess death in 2021. From weeks 13 to 26 in 2020, that was the first wave of the pandemic, so that's the blue line. The area under that curve, if you like, is 4,832. So there's 4,832 excess deaths underneath this blue curve here, this wave. And in this continuous period under the red line of excess death, we are seeing 3,542 excess deaths. In the whole of 2020, we saw 6,155 excess deaths. So we are about 1,400 deaths short, excess deaths short of our excess exceeding the 2020 excess in 2021. And at this rate, we are going to have more than 1,700 excess deaths in 2021 to come. Because we've got we have another 10 weeks to go, and we are regularly seeing over 200 excess deaths a week at the moment. So if we see 10 weeks of that, we will have 2,000 excess deaths. So I actually find it very hard to imagine that we are not going to exceed the 2020 death count, the 2020 excess death count. Graph 14 is just a closer look at 2021. You can look at that yourselves, but you can see that circulatory deaths were the second biggest cause of death in Scotland. I need to put cancer and Alzheimer's back into that graph, but I'll play with that later. And then there's another closer look. Yeah, the rest of the graphs are just an emphasis on what I have already said. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry I've gone on so long. There's just so many graphs there. There's 17 graphs in there, and this video's been 17 minutes, so it's a minute per graph. I'm very sorry about the news I'm delivering. I suppose now there's nothing anybody can do about these deaths. Many of them are baked in. There's obviously something that's killing a lot of people, and I'm very sorry about it. All we can do is track it and keep a historical record of it. I do love you. Stay tuned, stay sane, stay strong.